right, I think we can get started. Um, Hi everyone, welcome to the first event of the Regional Housing Partnerships Spring 2026 webinar series. Today we will be talking about the state of housing policy in Virginia. I know I'm very excited to hear everything covered today. Um, a little bit about the webinar series. We are focused on bringing in perspectives about housing from both in and outside of the region that can help shape our work. So there will be a few more of these events throughout the spring. So make sure that you're on our mailing list to hear more about them as they come. Um, and if there's any topic that you are interested in hearing, feel free to reach out to TJPDC staff and we will do our best to make that happen. Um, so today's speaker is Dr. Fabrizio Fasulo. He's the Director of Policy and Planning at Virginia Housing, where he leads a team of policy analysts and researchers in developing or in delivering program evaluations and public policy analyses for the organization's CEO, board, and leadership. Prior to joining Virginia Housing, Dr. Fasulo served as director and principal economist at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis in the School of Government at VCU. He holds a PhD in economics and institutions and a master's in urban and regional planning. His research interests include housing, urban and regional economics, policy evaluation, economic impact analysis, commercial district revitalization, and development policy. And I will pass it over to Fabrizio.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the Regional Housing Partnership and Thomas Jeff from PDC. As I mentioned before in our conversations, we are excited to be out in the community and start discussing these important topics. We understand that housing is on everyone's mind, so for us, it's also really useful to share our thoughts and understanding what the community is thinking around housing. I should also have two disclaimers here at the very beginning. All that I know is because I work with a really talented team of researchers and policy analysts, as Emily mentioned. One or two might be also connected today. So the work is really a collective work, and the analysis, a collective analysis that allows us to put together some of these thoughts I'm going to share with you. I hope you enjoy your lunch. The second is that the opinions that I express here are my own. It do not necessarily reflect the view of my organization. I understand this is a standard disclaimer for this type of analysis. Housing is also a very hot topic in development in terms of housing policy, as we're going to discuss today, especially towards the end. I'm going to move forward with the presentation here. Just so show you a little bit what we're going to cover during the conversation. We'll do a little introduction about Virginia Housing. I know that sometimes there is some confusion about what we do, how we differ from the HCD and so forth. So I'm going to cover that real quickly. And then the second part of this discussion is going to be around housing policy and the public discourse. This is something that I've been really thinking a lot over the past few years. Lots of conversations with my team, stakeholders, our leadership team. And what you're going to see here is going to be a little bit of those reflections put on paper, really. We're also going to look at some state and local solution to the affordability crisis. This is really work that my team has developed over the course of the past 2 years, collecting some best practices, but also dismantling some myths, if you want. We're going to look at one of those in particular. And then I'm going to wrap it up with a little bit of a summary of the General Assembly. We are still going through the analysis of it. As you know, there is still some work that is happening right now, especially on the administration side. In a couple of weeks, there's going to be the reconvene session, so we're going to know more about the budget. Then we expect another special session probably in May, but I'm going to touch on that later on in the presentation. Please feel free to interrupt me with any question if you want. I'm going to let Emily manage that, or if you want to collect all the questions for later for a Q&A, I think probably we're going to have enough time for some questions at the end if you all want. So I'm going to start a little bit about Virginia Housing. I don't know how many of you are familiar with us, but we are the Housing State Finance Agency. We are a quasi-governmental agency. We were created by the General Assembly in 1972 as a political subdivision, independent political subdivision of the Commonwealth. We are self-supported, meaning that we don't use taxpayer dollars. We raise funds on the private market. And so through that, and we reinvest our excess revenues, what a bank will call profits, in the community through our REACH fund. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We are separate but complementary to the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development, the ACD. You're all familiar with them. We are both under the Secretary of Commerce and Trade umbrella, and we do enjoy that partnership and that coordination. Because I think we think it's essential, really, to deliver the best services for Virginians. Our leadership has changed over the past few years. There's been a kind of a seismic change, if you want. Our previous CEO had been in place for 25 years. Virginia Housing, by many standards, not just because I work there, is really top in the class in the nation, really, as it comes to housing finance agency. So the leadership change didn't change our mission per se or the way in which we operate, but it has created a lot of opportunities for growth internally, a lot of leadership development, decision-making process. We have, I think, also a new focus now on policy development that we're going to discuss later on. And this is under the leadership of Tammy Neal, that's been appointed as CEO 2 years ago at this point, a little over 2 years ago. We are also connected to the administration through the Board of Commissioners that is appointed by the governor for the most part, except for the state treasurer, the director of the HCD, and another board member of the HCD that is appointed in that forum. The rest of the board members are appointed by the governor, and so that is one of the dotted line, if you want, between Virginia Housing and the administration. What do we do, though? That's the real question. Our mission is, of course, to provide affordable attainable houses for Virginian families, and we do that through three different programmatic divisions. We have also a lot of support roles like legal, the financial departments, policy and planning, and we're going to discuss a little bit about what my team and I do. But in general, we work around three programmatic units. The homeownership divisions that basically provide mortgages for first-time home buyers, and doesn't just provide mortgage, we also service throughout the duration of the mortgage. We don't sell the mortgage out in the market. We keep the services throughout the life of the mortgage. We also have a rental housing multifamily development division, if you want, and it's the division that is responsible also for administering the federal lower income housing tax credits and the state housing opportunity tax credits. And then, and through that division, of course, we make loans to developers that intend to develop affordable housing, together with the administration of the federal programs, and we can delve into more details if you want. And then we have something that is very specific and unique, if you want, to Virginia Housing. Very few housing finance agencies have this kind of structure. We have a community outreach division that is born out of the REACH funding that I was talking earlier about, and that you're going to have here in a second. Through the community outreach division, what we do is try to work with the housing ecosystem to support it, to strengthen it, to develop it, and to make sure that he has all the tools to implement Virginia housing programs and the overall administration goals when it comes to housing policy. As I mentioned earlier, the engine of all of this is the possibility for us to reinvest our excess revenues to REACH Virginia, which is a complementary fund to a lot of affordable housing programs and affordable housing development in general. We have decided to allocate this funding back in the 90s, and over time, this development, the development of this fund has been established in our statute, in our internal statute, and is governed by the Board of Commissioners that decide on the different type of set aside, if you want, every year. Right now, we are on a formula of 75% of excess revenues over 5 years, rolling average, as a basic formula, basically, for allocating this funding. Let me also talk a little bit about what we do as a policy and planning. We are a support unit, as I mentioned earlier, but a lot of what we're going to talk today is really touched by my team. We do a fair amount of work around market and policy analysis. And so from this perspective, we support our multifamily development division in creating hyper-local and regional and state market and policy analysis to understand what is the best approach to targeting in their lending programs. They also have a lot of sophisticated financial tools to support those decisions. We do a fair amount of program evaluation as well, trying to understand if our programs are really providing the right amount of targeting for what were our intentions for each of those programs. And from that perspective, we create a fair amount of reporting documents to both our leadership team and our board to keep them abreast on our operational activities. We have a separate section in our team dedicated to organizational development. So the entire strategy planning process that we just completed a few months ago was under the umbrella of my team. And that is for us an important way to understand what we do through our operation and programmatic units, and make sure to have everything within that framework that the board has approved as a strategic plan. And then finally, today we're going to discuss a lot about that. We have in our team our government legislative liaison. So everything that is about the legislative processes, so the General Assembly session, our congressional delegation in DC, as well the relationship with the administration, together with our CEO, goes under the umbrella of our government relation, Abby Westcott, who just joined Virginia Housing a few months ago. Housing is becoming, as we're going to discuss in a second, really hot topic. So we've been pretty busy. When I joined Virginia Housing in 2020, that was probably the inflection point when everything changed, mostly because of COVID, as we're going to see. But up to that point, the legislative focus on housing was really rare. There was a bipartisan support at federal level for the existing programs. At state level, there was a struggle really to allocate funding for some much needed rental support, especially for lower income families. But everything changed after COVID. And so that's really my starting point here. We're going to look a little bit on the before and after in the housing policy space. And why before and after? Well, it's a slow process, so it's difficult to pinpoint. But to me, there are a few things that are pretty clear in the analysis if you look like in a longer term, 5-10 years, and we try to make sense of where we are right now. First of all, the COVID pandemic really placed housing policy in the spotlight. If you remember, the national federal policy for tackling COVID was safer at home. That actually uncovered a lot of problems that we had in our housing markets throughout the country. And you're going to notice that I use the plural housing market. We don't never talk about one housing market. Even within the state, we have several regional housing markets. And that's important to understand the housing dynamic. It's one of the issues that we encountered early on when there was more spotlight on housing. It was really the poor access to housing data. And if you want housing knowledge or housing data interpretation, the policymaker had back then. And it's still something on which I think there is a fair amount of work happening through advocacy and nonprofit groups. They are trying to make an effort to really better understand the housing terminology across the different level of decision-making process. As I was mentioning, after COVID, housing became a major campaign issue for any election at any level of government. In addition to that, a new generation of housing leaders and advocates have emerged over the past 10 years. They are way more vocal and less subtle about proposing housing solutions. That has changed the way in which we look at housing and in which housing is really tackled in the public discourse. We're going to touch on that in a second. There is a persistent housing shortage, if not worsening, in some of the markets in the Commonwealth as well. The interesting piece here is that we start seeing at least 10 years ago when I was working at VCU before joining Virginia Housing. I was more in the economic development space, and the housing was starting to creep up as a major location factor. And so the fact that we have housing shortage is now touching even middle-income families. So it's not just a problem of affordable housing, but housing affordability, where the middle-income section of our households have also problem in accessing both rental opportunities and the ownership opportunities. That kind of caught the attention of additional layers of policy and decision makers, especially those that work in the economic development space. And so that has created the possibility of new synergies. Virginia Housing, for instance, has developed under the previous administration a new partnership with the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, the ACD, the Virginia Chamber. All these actors, they are now if you want, dipping their toes in the housing policy market. The other thing I think it's relevant to mention is that there is a new political and economic climate. The federal government under this second Trump administration is reshaping its structure. And to some extent, we know that at the end of whatever is going to be either the midterms or at the end of his term, the federal government is going to probably be slimmer. So from a policy perspective, we expect less funding available as a trend in the federal government and more demands being pointed to the state, regional, and local levels, if you want. So we expect an increased role of the state government. We have seen as Virginia Housing, as part of, as I mentioned earlier, quasi-governmental agency, we have seen an increase in demand and needs that we address. We have seen an increase in need for coordination among state agencies, as I mentioned earlier. So all of this is going to be staying here for a while. Let me also provide you a quick before and after that I think might make sense of what I was saying earlier. The public salience, housing was really the top voter issue before the change that I just mentioned before. Now, housing is consistently ranked in the top 3 voter concerns at any level of election. The ideological framing around housing was treated as a charity issue or personal responsibility. Affordable housing was considered really a small marginal problem of lower income families that might have made some mistake at some point in their wealth building path. Well, the reality is way more complex than that, and housing shortage now is debated as a market failure. We have a permanent market failure because of how we build housing and we distribute income on the lower side of the spectrum, and now we start to have in market failure, as I was saying earlier, on the middle income segment of our population. So there is some structural inequality there that is now perceived, discussed, and start to be addressed, if you want. There is a spotlight effect. Housing policy and programs before were relatively steady. There was little competition for tax-exempt bonds. While today there are way more solutions offered on the market, we have seen several new ways of building housing that is capturing our attention as well. And there is an increased needs in generating more competition for the same funding sources. That is like a direct effect in the way in which we allocate tax-exempt bonds, as I was saying earlier. Before it was just, for the most part, for housing. Now we have seen a demand coming from economic development, and even within the housing availability of funding of tax-exempt bonds, we have seen more competition for those monies. There is also, I think, this is like a positive aspect, increased cross-sector contamination, if you want, cooperation, visibility. Housing was before this change was sealed from jobs or economic competitive, even transportation to some extent, except for a local level. As a PDC, from this perspective, you might know more than I do. But today, housing policies are often a larger effort to promote sustainable community development. Over the past few years, we launched the Workforce Housing Initiative, where we are partnering, as I mentioned earlier, with BDP to create affordable and middle-income housing near new jobs. So to support the job creation agenda that the previous government had laid out, together with mitigating the housing shortage problems in those regions. So that has been a successful experiment pilot that we have had in the past few years. There is also a different approach from a legislative perspective, and this is more on a federal level than the state one, if you want. Before there were clear roles with a defined constitutional framework, we knew where the bills were starting, where they were ending, where the lobbyists at the federal level or our government relations could intervene and maybe sway one way or the other. Now the process is way more randomized than we've seen in the past few years. The rescission power is something that we're looking with concern because it can be used for cutting funding already allocated by Congress for housing programs as well. That was actually in the books last year and then eventually was scrapped. There is also the entire reconciliation process that might create some policy change. They are more partisan than they were before. And that's the other one, the political polarization. Unfortunately, we have seen a shift from a bipartisan support in a way around housing. Now we are seeing polarization around cultural issues that might affect housing as well. So, for instance, one thing the HUD is pursuing right now is to remove from the assistance those mixed status families that have members that might be undocumented immigrants, or prorate the assistance for those families as well. So there is still like that discussion happening, and that is across party lines. So we are seeing some political polarization there as well. Um, and let me go to the next one. State housing policy. I believe this is the last one in terms of before and after, and I'm going to move to some examples. I'm going a little long. But on the state housing policies, housing was mostly seen before as a local function. You know a lot about this and the competition among local governments, an irrational competition, if I may say so. Since from that perspective, housing for the most part, it is a regional function more than it is a local function. And so it would be useful to have some level of regional cooperation. Same around zoning. Zoning is not neutral. It's not just a local function at this point. In the sense that zoning impede or allows housing development, that too should be considered in those conversations today. But what's happening today? What we are observing, and we have seen that also in Virginia in this past General Assembly session, states are moving towards a more prescriptive housing goals. And so there are really new bills being introduced throughout the country at state level to be more prescriptive in zoning goals for local governments, either through incentives, so the carrot, if you want, or through some enforcement mechanisms, so through some carrots. There are states like Massachusetts and Oregon, they are withholding CDBG grant funding when housing targets are not met. So there is some level of, say, give and take in some states that are already happening. But in general, we are seeing a trend of housing moving really towards a more prescriptive zoning type of policy. And then housing and economic development. This has been especially interesting for us to observe over the past 3 years. How many new actors have came in and start looking at housing policy, understanding how they can also be a positive force at local level to move the discussion forward in terms of permitting, zoning, and so forth. So we've been collaborating and cooperating with all different sorts of entities, including the Virginia Chamber and their blueprint. We've been partnering with the BDP. At the local and regional level, we do enjoy, I know it's not economic development per se, but the work that we've been doing with the PDCs and with you all. I think that's the right place for us to be, and we're going to continue to explore them. Well, let me now switch gears for a second and put together here a few slides from a presentation. The two of my colleagues, DJ Benway and Mike McKenzie, our lead policy analyst and home ownership specialist policy analyst, have put together last year for a conference. Some housing solutions that we have seen working, or at least being promising, if you want, across the country. The first one that I want to touch on is on public development. This is kind of a foreign concept right now, but it was not really that long ago. In the United States, the public government at different level was involved in building housing, especially during the 1940s and 50s. A lot of neglect and a lack of maintenance made it easy during the 80s to push forward the argument that the public shouldn't be involved. And that's when the LIHTC, which is a public-private partnership, really in essence, came about. However, there are some states and local governments that are kind of reverting that trend, trying to understand if there is a role for public government in developing housing. So Montgomery County, Maryland, has put together $100 million in revolving loan fund for low-cost construction financing. This is a 5-year construction loan to replace some equity in affordable housing projects. And the fund is capitalized by general obligation bonds from the county. In Atlanta, in Georgia, the Urban Development Corporation there, it was put together to develop affordable units on public land with less reliance on public subsidy than what you see on Montgomery, so a P3 model, public-private partnership. But the idea is to cross-subsidize affordable housing units through the market rate in mixed income development, which is an innovative concept per se. not financially, maybe, but being intentional at local level of doing something like that. And then in Chicago and in Illinois, this is in development. There is a green social housing revolving fund. They're putting together. The discussion is around in the magnitude of 115 to 135 million dollars for a loan program that we understand should be similar to what they have in Montgomery County. We also have seen a fair amount of work on the public-private partnership outside the LIHTC program. So the bond recycling, I'm going to touch on very quickly on it, the land acquisition financing and mezzanine financing. The bond recycling in particular is a financial tool to recycle, again, as the word says so, tax-exempt bond to be reissued without using further tax-exempt bond capacity. So basically stretching the tax-exempt bond capacity. Right now, there is a major challenge for this type of effort. I believe Virginia Housing has not done yet. We have been studying probably one or two, but we have not pulled the trigger on it. The major challenge right now is the timeline for the reissuance of the bond is 6 months. That creates some major challenges for the developers to really comply within that timeline and make sure that we have both the projects and the paperwork in time. There are right now in Congress discussion to extend that timeline to 12 or 18 months, but even 12 months would allow for a lot of projects, according to several studies, to move forward. So extending basically the capacity of the tax-exempt bonds. The second one is the land acquisition financing that we have seen in some part of the country. In Washington State, the Housing Finance Corporation there provide loans to developers in the Seattle region to purchase loan for affordable housing. Microsoft there funded the program with $75 million. It's not the only example of Microsoft or big companies being partners in housing development. Loans were offered only 5% interest, so below what was in market rate. And in addition to that, Washington State Housing Finance Agency offer interest rate breaks, half to 3% percentage point for zoning change to allow for a waiver in parking requirements. And sorry, I lost this other piece. Waiving parking requires increased density near transit, streamlined permitting, which is something that we heard in Virginia being one of the major issue, more than actual cost of development, and then providing tax credits for the first years of operation. I think it was before 5 and 10 years of operation. And then finally, mezzanine financing, which is another financial approach to support affordable housing multifamily developments. So traditionally, a new multifamily development has a 25% roughly ownership equity, and then 75% of traditional financing through different sources that, if you look at a capital stock for affordable housing development, can have up to 20, 25, 30, we have even more than that, different sources that are as a couple up together during the process. The private sale capital structure of the mezzanine financing will allow for selling basically 30% of the equity. In this case, we took the example of Microsoft, and the benefits of this program are really in how the deal is structured from a financial perspective. In this particular case, Microsoft investment was subordinated to the senior loans, so the traditional investor maintained profits potentially and micro expenses if the project were to go south. The other few elements I want to mention are, as I was saying before, there are a few state interventions that we are looking at, that we are trying to understand how much of that is replicable here in Virginia, or at least proposed to the public discussion. There are incentive-based reforms like the one that we've seen in New York with the pro-housing community incentives that's been created in 2023. Or in Utah, we have seen the flexibility in infrastructure and development financing, which is something that we are also exploring in Virginia. As you know, the Department of Resources, I think in 2024, was enabled to issue bonds for infrastructure financing for affordable housing. I believe they've already done one or two projects, so something is moving there. But then, as I mentioned earlier, there are also other interventions that are more prescriptive. So the second group of state interventions that you see here is the partial complete ban on restriction related to ADUs, parking minimum, and single family zoning. In there, you usually find the usual suspects, those states that have a stronger tradition of land use, state land use regulations, but also some new ones like Florida that we didn't expect to see there. And instead, there are a couple of bills that are going in that direction. Then finally, I want to close real quick what we have seen so far in this new General Assembly session. It was an important session for many reasons. New governor, new administration, a new Democratic majority in both chambers, we assume a majority in the House. So there was a lot of room for proposing a lot of new legislation, including on housing. Earlier on, when we start following the discussion around new bills being introduced, there was a sense there was no legislators wanted to be left behind in a housing bill. So each legislator wants really to have at least one housing bill in their portfolio. And that created really a wide range of housing intervention that the chambers sift through over the course of their session. Here, I'm going to give you a quick summary, really, of what we've been providing also to our leadership team. A few bills that were directly involving Virginia housing. You see here four, but there were actually a dozen bills that were directly mentioning Virginia housing. In my tenure over the past 6 years, I think we had 6 bills total that were touching on Virginia housing. That gives you the idea of how housing has been at the center of the policy debate during this assembly session. So much so that they also allocated new funding, or at least they've been requesting new funding for a new revolving loan fund on which the HCD and Virginia Housing are going to collaborate. The HCD is going to be administering it. And this is about developing affordable housing with a deeper targeting, 50% or lower than it is allowed through the Housing Trust Fund. So this is a complementary tool if you want. You may have heard that it's been through HB 1227 a change in the allocation of the state ceiling on private activity bonds in the housing segment. The housing portion was increased. That was important because it allows us for better planning and programming around funding available for both the multifamily programs and single family programs. There's been a bill we call it Faith in Housing, that will allow religious organizations to start developing some land. This is a step forward from last year. The bill was vetoed by the administration. This year, the administration is in favor. I believe it's been already signed. There are also some more control elements, if you want, for local governments to keep their zoning autonomy, if you want. And then we had a fair amount of work around the bill that, to me, was really instructive. This was a bill that was requiring every development funded by Virginia Housing to allow for companion pets, which is a beautiful cause, and on its face, it looks amazing. The problem there is that, as mentioned earlier, all our funding, including our loans that we do, are private funding. So that would have been basically adding a statutory requirement on our lending practice, making it more disadvantageous on the market. So we would have lost a competitive advantage there. This was a classical case of a special interest, as noble as it could be, the accommodation of companion pets, which afflicts in particular lower income folks that have more problems in finding housing. But in this case, it was really trampling on a general interest, if you want, which is right now the development of affordable housing. The bill eventually failed. We hope that the proponent's going to be in touch with us and do some work on how we can frame it in a more effective way. But that was a very interesting process we went through. And then we are doing some analysis more on, if you want, by area of focus. We are looking at zoning as a major component of the solution to affordable housing and to the housing crunch that we have right now. So we were very happy to see several zoning bills being having more traction than in previous years. there's still a conversation with local governments and their organizations, VML and VACO in particular, on what is the sweet spot. But I think the conversation that started this year was even more advanced than we were expecting. Some bills here that you see on screen, in particular HB4 with the right of first refusal, ROFR bill, that allows localities basically to preserve some of the affordable housing if they find a suitable buyer to keep the covenant in place. The biggest achievement, probably from our perspective, again, zoning is not neutral, so I like to stress this is a big achievement, was HB 655 that allows manufactured housing to be built in all zones that have been zoned for site-built housing. So almost equating them in a way. Parking minimums requirements being banned. That two ways the government's action. I don't think she's been signed on. And then there were a couple of bills that failed, but they kind of start the conversation, if you want, on housing near jobs that would allow that for housing development on 75% of land that was contained in commercial business district. And then another one, statewide housing targets. As I mentioned earlier, some states have already taken that road to provide localities with targets that they need to abide by. I don't think we are there in Virginia, but that is a discussion that is starting. And I believe it's something where there needs to be a positive conversation among all parties, local governments, developers, advocates, housing finance agencies, local and regional and state, and so forth. So we look forward for additional work on this over the next year. We also saw a lot of tenants protection bills, lots of bills that passed that were vetoed in previous years, including increasing the mandatory waiting period for landlord remedies from 5 to 14 days, defining air conditioning as essential, the itemized bill for renters, the expanding of criteria for the eviction diversion programs. Those were all goals that in the previous years have been put aside when the political climate was a little bit different. Instead, these are General Assembly sessions, there were a lot of wins on this side. There's seen also some bills to expand funding for housing, some in form of pilot programs, including this urban public-private partnership for a redevelopment grant program. We have seen, as I mentioned earlier, the revolving loan fund that will be administered by the HCD. In general, there's been a focus on increasing the funding sources, either to tax credits or new funding for housing or housing adjacent activities. And that was actually my last slide. So I'm going to pause here and come up for air and see if there are any questions.
All right, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I definitely learned a lot. If anybody has questions, either raise your hand and come off mute, or feel free to put it in the chat. Um, I'll give it a minute for everyone to get their thoughts together.
We are always happy to also find any question via email. I think the last slide includes my email address. Feel free to shoot me an email, or one of my team members, I believe our director is online. We're more than happy to engage in conversation. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar also with our community outreach team. We have Chris Thompson that is usually on top of our relationship with our local governments and our PDC network. So there is some connection there that you can always get some resources from. And I'm going to stop sharing probably now. Clear is paused.
All right. We got our first question in the chat. Thank you, Chris. So the question is, as tax credits become more competitive, are there any plans to make sure that they continue to be a viable part of financing for housing?
Yeah, this is the challenge. The problem is really the cost per unit. And so we have seen some regions now, in a few weeks, we have a regional board meeting that we do every year as a sort of board retreat. We're going to go to Bristol in Southwest Virginia. Housing units there, I think it touched $400,000 per unit price point, which is very similar to what we see in some more dynamic markets. But the reality is that the cost is driven by regional and local factors. And then in particular, there's a shortage of workforce, a shortage of developers, general contractors, even access to credit is limited there. I'm saying all this to say that the tax credits can stretch up to a point, and our team is very creative in a way in finding new solutions to make sure that the QAP is up to date and reflects what is really needed at that moment in time. The capital stack, we have really a very talented team of financial officers in our multifamily divisions. And so they work with the developers to make sure that the capital stack is viable. But the tax credits is just one of the sources. As I mentioned earlier in those examples, finding additional sources. I'm going to add also another element. I think the focus, the convergent focus right now of economic development on housing might be a double-edged sword. On one side, we've seen more interest from the economic development community around housing. But on the other hand, we haven't seen funding yet coming in. And so if you think about the existing funding available for the development of housing, put together in the same pot, whatever the HCD does, our programs, local programs, and so forth. If the pot is the same, but the needs now extend to the middle income housing and there are no additional sources, that's going to be a problem. Of course, LIHTC in this case, as you know, it's limited, I think, all the way up to 80%. So it's not going to be used for middle income housing. But the competition around resources is definitely an issue. But I'm saying it's double-edged sword because on the other hand, it could be, and that's the way in which I like to frame it, that we are able to unlock new resources for housing. I'll give you an example that I think it would be useful to discuss at some point. Go Virginia is an amazing tool that the administration, that the Commonwealth has to promote economic development. However, we cannot fund, because of the statute of Go Virginia, we cannot fund housing or housing-related initiative like workforce development, construction workforce development. That would be a low-hanging fruit that could be probably reached very easily. And that would be a way of unlocking additional resources for housing. So it's stretching also the way in which these federal programs. I should also add that the last bill, the last budget that was approved through the OBBA, One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OB3 as it's called in DC, has increased the availability, the fund availability for LIHTC by restoring basically a 12.5% expansion that had been that expired. So from that perspective, this has been a good year from the LIHTC for the LIHTC program. Yes, permanent supportive housing. That, as you know, is those are from a housing finance perspective are the most difficult deals to do, and it's also where there is less funding in terms of programs. We are extremely concerned right now on what is the federal environment, and I don't know, many of you have followed what happened with notice of funding opportunity for the continuum of care, and now the change the Trump administration had made late in the process that jeopardized funding availability for local providers starting in January. I believe some funding lapse happened actually for some nonprofits. Eventually, the courts intervened and restored the system, but that is something that is very much on top of the housing ecosystem mind. From what we are concerned now in Virginia housing, we have a dedicated unit working around permanent supportive housing. And we expect, because it came out strong during our strategic planning process, that there's going to be a focus also in terms of multifamily development as much as we can. We are already using some pilots solutions, like, for instance, the project-based housing choice, the project-based vouchers that I think we have piloted last year for the first time, and that seems to be promising. We are also working in a strong partnership with our trade organization and national level to make sure that their lobbying around funding and funding levels is successful. Unfortunately, presidential budget request that came out, I believe, 2 days ago, has a lot of cuts in the housing programs, including the continuum of care. I believe they zeroed out in the request. However, as you know, the request is different from what the Congress budgeted last year. We had a similar request coming out from the Trump administration, and then eventually the budget reenacted the entire HUD budget, including those funding. So we'll see what happens there. Okay.
If there's no questions in the chat at the moment, I can jump in with a question.
Yep.
During your presentation of different programs you've seen around the country that have worked, I saw that there were a lot of really interesting ideas coming from larger cities or larger communities. Have you seen any examples of innovative programs that scale well for smaller or more rural areas?
Yeah, that's the real challenge, I think. And actually, we do have in our strategic plan, it's organized around three different themes. It's production, preservation, and then the third one I call it location in a way, but it's really the regional and rural areas type of development. And so it is difficult. Even Virginia Housing use what we call the really bespoke type of approach to development, where you try to put together everything that you can to make a development happen. I think there is the need for some systemic change. As I was mentioning earlier, for instance, the possibility of training workforce should be something that we should explore seriously, because some of the challenges that these rural areas are experiencing is, especially around production, is on the lack of workforce and capital. But there is a problem, and as my lead policy analyst reminds me, we are not going to get out of this crisis just by building. We need also to understand where to build, and so the rural piece come out strong, but also where to preserve affordable housing. I think one of the problems that we're seeing in rural areas is these dilapidated properties that get at some point so in bad shape that it doesn't make sense to maintain. We have started on a similar area of work, a project with Housing for Virginia, in which we're going to start monitoring our LIHTC properties and they roll off compliance period, trying to understand how much we can put together in terms of strategy to preserve those that are about to roll off compliance. So it's a multifaceted approach that needs to happen there, even for the rural areas. I believe some of the problems though are structural, and again, access to workforce and funding is one, zoning is another, infrastructure development and maintenance is another one that I think is pretty big. So we do have, as a Virginia Housing, as I mentioned earlier, an entire focus on the regional approach, and particularly on the rural approach for this reason. Are there any initiatives for Virginia Housing to leverage funds and assets by way of program-related investments to the Regional Community Foundation for Virginia that could support the local housing initiative in communities? This is a good question, and I think it's a question also that would be useful to ask Chris Thompson, our Director of Strategic Housing. I believe we have already an existing working relation with the Community Foundation. If I had to guess, they are part of the capital stack often with their grants and the housing initiatives. I'm not privy of the details of their housing strategy, but we do, as I mentioned earlier, our business model is partnership. We couldn't do what we do if we wouldn't partner with private sector, nonprofits, foundations. And so from that perspective, we're always open to see opportunities for collaboration. I think the game, as I was saying earlier, is really called capital stack. And from that perspective, anything that can help to put together that funding gap that we were seeing earlier in the slides, the better. But this is something I'm going to pass along to our Chris Thompson, our Director of Strategic Housing, for sure. Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure. If there are no other questions, Emily, I'm going to hand it over to you. I don't know if we have anything else before we close, but this has been a great opportunity for me, and I hope it was informative in some form for you as well. Please reach out if you have any additional questions after we close the call.
All right, thank you everybody for coming. Yeah, um, Fabrizio, can we send out your email afterwards to participants in case that they have additional questions that they think of? Great.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Bye bye. Bye, Emily. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.